This is Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Jen Chavez. A story remains alive only so long as it's retold, writes environmental journalist and author Jason Dove Mark. True of so many things in this world, including the story of our changing environment. In his new book, The Earth Said Remember Me, he explores the different ways people can resist environmental amnesia. One example, and the focus of an excerpt recently published by High Country News, involves a decades-long re-photo project at Mount Shasta in Northern California. Jason Dove Mark joins us now to share more about it. Jason, welcome to Think Out Loud, and congratulations on the release of your new book.
Hi, Jen. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So the excerpt of your book that I just mentioned that was recently published, it starts off by describing shifting baseline syndrome, particularly as it relates to climate. You wrote that it could be thought of as the great getting used to, which I really loved. Can you say more about what that is and why it's an important concept to be thinking about?
Yeah, so shifting baseline syndrome, it can sound like a sort of clinical phrase, a little academic, but it really just describes the way that each of us in all of our lives are very adaptable and how we grow used to things and grow accustomed to them. So the classic example comes from fisheries, where each generation of fishermen sort of set their baseline expectation of how the seas are supposed to look according to the fish they caught at the beginning of their career, not realizing that what they would consider a big catch would be considered small fry by the old timers that came before them. And the problem, of course, is that we keep getting used to things in a negative way. So the earlier part of the segment, you talked about wildfires in Oregon. So the smoke storms that have hit the East Coast, the heat waves that have hit Europe and good parts of the US. They used to be called extreme. They used to be called abnormal. And now they're the new normal. And the dangers there is that we just get used to this stuff and we lose the urgency for action.
So, in this excerpt of your book that recently came out, you focus on Mount Shasta's glaciers. How have they been changing?
Yeah, so glaciers would be another great example,
Mm.
right? So somebody who was born 50, 60 years ago, they're going to remember the Mount Shasta glaciers or other glaciers in the Cascade Range as being more full and longer, broader, thicker glaciers than, say, somebody who was born in the year 2000 and is now 26 years old. And so they're just going to reset their baseline expectation for what a normal Mount Shasta looks like. So then the question becomes, well, how do you reveal this? How do you make this apparent to people? And one great example is through what's called rephotography.
Hmm. Yeah. So this project that you give us a look into is this. It's this rephotography project, rephoto project that was started by a citizen scientist in the 70s and has been kept going by a string of people for over 50 years. And I know you interviewed the person who started it all, Phil Rhodes, as well as a Forest Service ranger that's keeping it going today, Forrest Coots. What did you learn from them about what inspired them to do this and what motivated them to keep doing this really long-term dedicated work?
Yeah, so Phil just kind of got into this, and he's now in his 70s, lives in Corte Madera, California, in Marin County. He got into this in the 1970s as an undergraduate at Humboldt State, which is now called Cal Poly Humboldt. He was a mountaineer, he was a backpacker, and he could see from his own experiences that the glaciers on Mount Shasta were acting strangely. At that point, they were shrinking and then expanding, and then have pretty much been shrinking most of this time. So he just, on his own dime and on his own time, set up 14 different photo stations on Mount Shasta. And every year, diligently, went back to them to take the same photo of the same glacier from the same perspective, but just a year apart. And when you look through his photos, you can see that the glaciers on Mount Shasta are clearly shrinking due largely to climate change. Then as he got older, he handed it off first to a student at Portland State who was in the geology department there, who eventually sort of handed it off to some Forest Service rangers who at first did it as a lark. It's kind of a break from their normal day job rescuing mountaineers on Mount Shasta, but then who over time developed this, I guess you call it this loyalty, this affinity to the project. They felt a real, as Forrest told me, a real responsibility to the record to keep it going, as if the record itself took on kind of a geologic force.
And I know that one of the rangers took you up to Mount Shasta to see a photo station at Whitney Glacier, one of the photo stations that Phil Rhodes began his work at so many years ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience? How did it feel to be there? What did you take away from being able to do that with him?
Yeah, so we went to check out the Whitney Glacier, which is the longest, some say the largest, but certainly the longest glacier in the state of California, and the first glacier in California to be positively identified by Western scientists in the 1860s and 70s. So we went up the north side of the mountain. That's a largely trackless wilderness. Most people who summit Mount Shasta come on the south side. So we were pretty much by ourselves. Forrest he grew up, he spent his whole life in the town of Shasta. He knows the mountain arguably better than anybody else, navigated us through this trackless wilderness until we climbed, several thousand feet, and got to this bench of rock and ice. And he pointed to this totally anonymous boulder, like about this, the size of like a Volkswagen Beetle. He said, "Well, we're here." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "This is the spot." And it was a totally ordinary, anonymous boulder, which of course only had meaning because Phil had at some point put a marker on it, established this as his photo station. Later, with advanced technology, Forrest and Company had sort of geolocated it with GPS technology. And so this became essentially this one just salmon-colored boulder was this anchor point to creating a record of environmental change in California and in the Cascades over time.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking right now about work by citizen scientists to document Mount Shasta's melting glaciers with Jason Dove Mark. He's the author of the book, The Earth Said Remember Me. So Jason, what has happened to all of these photos? There must be so many from over the years. And did you get an opportunity to take a look at them for this story?
Yeah, so many of them for a while went to a project that is run by a former geology professor, now retired at Portland State, named Andrew Fountain. He's got an incredible repository called Glaciers of the American West. Though now that he's retired, it's a little dated. So many of the photos went there. Many of them went to another geologist named Hassan Basajic, who's got his own site where people can see them. I don't want to bum people out, but unfortunately, the story doesn't exactly have a happy ending. So the year after Forrest took me up the mountain, he left his job at the Forest Service. The then staff that was remaining has really struggled to keep it going. When Forest Service staff responded to requests from me and High Country News to update the story before publishing this excerpt, they said, quote unquote, we're kind of doing our best with the manpower we have. As listeners know, there's been a lot of cuts to the federal government, to the Forest Service, and other federal agencies, other land management agencies. And basically, they've struggled to keep it going. They didn't, take very many photos in 2025 and just a few in 2024. And so I think what the takeaway is for folks is, certainly professional scientists in federal agencies and state agencies, they can do a lot of amazing work, right, to collect data about changes in the living world. But there's no substitute for the extra muscle power that citizen scientists, that community scientists bring to these efforts. So there's so many wonderful programs out there. There's a thing called Adventure Scientists, which basically enlists backpackers and mountaineers and backcountry hunters and anglers to take data from remote forest places, remote wildlands. There's a thing called Coco Raz, which enlists people in taking precipitation readings from their just backyard or their apartment or wherever they live, because weather stations can only gather so much, and this gives scientists a much more fine-toothed understanding of precipitation patterns. So it's a bummer that the federal agencies have not been able to keep it up, but hopefully some other citizen scientists will be able to pick up the baton and keep it going, because there's something that people can do no matter where they live to help gather this information about a changing world.
Reading this excerpt from your piece, I was thinking about like all of these figures of speech that we have, like seeing is believing. I'll believe it when I see it, and so forth. And I wonder, what power do you think visual records, and photography in particular, have when it comes to preserving the historical record versus the many types of other historical records that we have out there?
Yeah, I mean, we live in a visual culture, obviously, and we're awash in images and videos all the time. I think, I wrote the first draft of this chapter was just, books take time. When I wrote the first draft of this chapter a few years ago, it felt very real to say that there's no arguing with a picture in front of your eyes. And I do think that photographic evidence, like the work that Phil Rose and others have done, provides an indelible record of how the Earth is changing, really being transformed, or if you prefer, deformed before our eyes. And there's the very real phenomenon of AI slop. So, all of us questioning things that we see and really wondering, is that real? Is that a real photo of an elephant, like picking up a baby gorilla or something like this you see online, and you're like, I think that's just AI slop. So I think it's a double-edged sword, right, Jen? There's photos are certainly more immediate than, say, reading through like a table of charts and numbers and graphs, and most people aren't going to do that. So photos are incredibly powerful in that way. And I worry, as I think a lot of people worry, that we're sort of entering this post-truth era where it's hard to know what's real and what's not because of all the AI slop. That said, I'd rather have people take the photos than not. And I think the photos tell an incredible story. And if people go and check out the story on High Country News, you can see some of Phil's images, and again, they're hard to argue with, and they pack a punch, I think, much more viscerally than if you just were, looking at numbers on a graph.
Something that you kind of touched on a minute ago, but I don't know. I think a lot of people sometimes struggle to know what they can do in the face of climate change. It feels so huge. It's easy to feel despair about it sometimes. But here you have examples of people doing something within the scope of their own lives. So, I mean, what would you, if there are folks listening right now and being like, I could do something like this, like, what would you say to those people?
I mean, I think some of the most accessible things is the Audubon Christmas bird count. It's been going on for more than 100 years now. People who are bird watchers, or even if you're not a bird watcher and you just want to go out and get trained, hook up with your local Audubon chapter and go out and look at the birds in your area at the end of the year. It's usually the last couple weeks in December. That's one of the longest running citizen scientist projects. The Portland-based organization, the Xerces Society, which works for the preservation and the conservation of insects, has got all sorts of citizen science efforts. I already mentioned adventure scientists and CocoRaws. I mean, there's so many programs that, the California Academy of Sciences has got iNaturalist. So there's just a wealth of opportunities out there for people to find some ways to go out to just collect a little bit of data about the world around them. And it will then be funneled to working scientists, and it will help to contribute to the larger body of knowledge that we need to, as I said at the beginning, sustain the urgency for environmental action.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this and for all your work around these issues.
Thank you, Jen. It was a real thrill.
Jason Dovemark is a Washington environmental journalist and the author of the book, The Earth Said, Remember Me. Coming up tomorrow on the show, the Trump administration is rewriting Bureau of Land Management rules to increase the number of cattle and other livestock that can graze on public lands. The rules affect 155 million acres in the West, an area more than 2.5 times the size of Oregon. We'll get more details about the plan and its impact on public lands. Our production staff includes Malia Fass, Rolly Hernandez, Gemma DiCarlo, senior producer Allison Frost, and managing producer Shiraz Sadiq. Nalene Silva and Layla Isbell engineer the show from the Gert Boyle studio. Our technical director is Stephen Cray, and our executive producer is Sage Van Wang. Thank you very much for tuning in to Think Out Loud on OPB and KLCC. Have a great day.
Think Out Loud is supported by Steve and Jan Oliva, the Rose E. Tucker Charitable Trust, Ray and Marilyn Johnson, the Susan Hammer Fund of Oregon Community Foundation, and the Lang Svengard Family Fund.